my key to start. Yeah, so penal reform started focusing more on lived experience about 3 years ago, when we started a global group of experts by experience, we called it, to help us mainstream lived experience in the organization and also in projects that we run. So we started reaching out through social media, and at one point we had 5 people join us from across the world. And the idea was to meet also a little bit informally, about 4 or 5 times a year online, to share practices, to share experiences, and to update each other about achievements, challenges, etc. So this was really successful. One of the first activities we did is decide about the ground rules and develop a charter of the global group in a co-created way. So that's something we developed, we published. You can find it on our website. And that actually also inspired us developing a 10-point plan on how to involve people with lived experience in policy reform. Helped by our work in Armenia, our work in Indonesia, and our work in Uganda, also working with people with experience. So that's a document we published a year ago. That inspired our multi-annual strategy that we launched last year, which has 8 goals, and one of the goals is about lived experience. And finally, our last Global Prison Trends also has a feature on lived experience and is a bit more practical. So featuring all sorts of projects around the world working with lived experience. Yeah, and as I said, Dwayne, I think we got in contact with you about a year ago or something, because we asked you to write a blog on our website on lived experience, and which was a great blog. You can still find it on our website. And we started discussing. He shared the idea to come to the Netherlands to present his book. So we thought, why not organize this informal launch / book presentation? So I think that's the moment I can give you the word.
Yes, thanks very much, Raoul, and thanks for having me and my wonderful colleagues here. And I was told that there is a strict time limit, so I'm going to try and stick to that time limit, because I know I can be quite talkative and loquacious. So I've written some parts out that will hopefully go all the points that we want to make. But before I begin, thanks very much to Raoul, Olivia, and the Penal Reform International team for convening this really important conversation on lived experience. And I think the timing could not be more apt, given that globally we are witnessing a rising tide and a groundswell in interest in lived experience across criminal justice systems, across not-for-profit organizations, across charity establishments. And we can also see that these organizations are creating their own approaches to doing lived experience work. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to come here together and talk about some of these achievements and challenges and some ways forward for us. I'm really also excited and glad to be having this conversation and sharing the floor with some wonderful and important friends from the United Kingdom. I'm joined by Dr. Jill Buck from the University of Chester, Dr. Donna Arendelli from the University of Southampton, Scott Kidd from the University of Lincoln, Kemi Ryan from Reformed Development, and Paula Harriott, the Chief Executive of Unlock in the UK, who will share their insights in turn. But before they do, I kind of want to take this opportunity to set the scene and provide some context for our discussion. In our conversations, we thought we wanted to provide a kind of working definition of what we thought lived experience was or is. But we also want to recognize and honor that lived experience work is messy. It's iterative, it's personal, and it's continuously changing. And I think I invite all of us today to kind of sit in that complexity and that nuance that we might not be able to capture in this definition. So for us, lived experience is embodied. It's firsthand knowing that arises from moving through the criminal justice system, as well as adversity, and from a reflective labor that turns suffering into insight. It holds the dual truth that harm can both wound and disclose capacities for strength, care, and wisdom carried in bodies, memories, kin, and community. More than testimony, it is a mode of knowing. It's proximately gained, ethically frayed, and relational, which unsettles hierarchies that privilege distant expertise. As a bridge, it links personal narrative to collective understanding. It reorients reform towards dignity, healing, and belonging. In practice, lived experience names the right and the responsibility to read one's own life as text, to refuse conditioned mindsets that deny equal standing, and to co-create forms of healing justice in which individuals and communities recover together by imagining and building systems that repair rather than reproduce harm. So that's a definition that I asked my colleagues, what do we think of lived experience? And we all had our own feelings and definitions and thoughts, and I tried to distill that. But to kind of summarize that, I thought there were 5 main components of what we think lived experience is. For us, it's about this idea of embodiment and proximity, that truth is disclosed up close in bodies, places, and routines of the criminal justice system, and within the fine grain of the criminal justice system and beyond. It's about this duality. It's about adversity can both break and unlock wounds. And when we work through these, they become sources of practical and grounded wisdom. It's also about reflective practice. And through this reflection, dialogue, and shared meaning making, experience is turned into communicable knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge that we can use to repair, hopefully, repair systems that are broken. It's also about epistemic justice. It's about voices at the margins can carry authority equal and often correcting official or institutional accounts that don't reflect the realities of people within the system. And it's about this idea of an orientation to repair. It's about healing justice, that policy, research, and practice should be co-created with those most effective. So change is both humane, truthful, just, and reflective of the very realities of the people that the system most impacts. And moving from that definition, I'd like to share some of the kind of work that we have collectively done and the work that I've specifically done in this space. So as I'm not introduced myself, I am a lecturer in sociology and criminology at the University of South Australia. And in the context of Australia, I believe I'm the only person within an ongoing academic position that's had interaction with the criminal justice system. I served 2 separate sentences of incarceration, totaling up to 4 years in 2 different jurisdictions within Australia. Since then, I've collaborated with these wonderful people here and beyond, and I've worked towards trying to get an understanding and how lived experience might be reflected in the policy work that we all do individually here in this space. And since then, moving out of Australia, I've gone to my home country of the Philippines and thought about how lived experience might work in that space and how we might turn lived experience into a particular type of expertise within that space. And Jerome and Raul and I had this conversation about there is so much interest in lived experience. There is so much promise of lived experience, and that lived experience is meant to do all these things. And I kind of want to reflect on kind of these successes and perhaps areas of improvement. And as we can see globally, I know in my home country of Australia, there are lived experience panels in each state and territory that work within governments, that work within charities. And in the past 3, 4, 5 years, I've seen a real difference in what lived experience can do. It's given careers for people like me who've been to prison. It's given an opportunity. I'm given this very platform and to share this with my colleagues, to share the wisdom and knowledge I've gained. It's also, I think, provided my students who are doing criminology at the university I teach, the perspective that they wouldn't otherwise get from other academics. And it's led to collaborations which build this community that we're here making and doing right now. And it's allowed for co-production, co-producing solutions, co-producing our understanding of problems within the criminal justice system, and also co-producing ideas around how we can work towards this idea of repair, this idea of healing justice. But on the flip side, I also want to raise awareness around how, yes, there have been many successes, and these successes have been important. but there is still a long way to go for lived experience experts to be really part of the table, to have a seat at the table and share their knowledge and insights without being scared that there might be a backlash. And, you know, an example of that is globally, the United Nations, for example, works towards these various rules and regulations that talk about making prisons more humane, more safe. And yet we know that the United Nations excludes people like us from being employed because of our criminal records. And I certainly, in my work, I cannot work on an ongoing basis for the United Nations. I cannot work for big organizations around the globe. The other challenge is doing this work requires collaboration, not Zoom collaborations, but in-person collaborations, you know, having the kind of effective atmospheres of this very space that allows us to feel and think things through. But yet people with criminal records are not able to travel to places like this. It's a challenge for people with criminal records to travel to the United States, to the United Kingdom, and soon Europe, given that Europe will have these conditions which require us to declare our criminal records. And so I guess in setting that scene, there are great things and there are important things that we see lived experience as a form of promise, but there are certain barriers that we need to think about as a community as to how we might resolve these issues to allow us to continue to have this work and for us to continue to have this discussion. And as I said, lived experience is iterative. It's sitting in the discomfort and messiness of the not knowing and the knowing. And I think, you know, for us to do that, there needs to be a real community shift around how do we get lived experience in important stages, such as the United Nations, in important stages, such as all around the world, and how do we remove those barriers for people with lived experience to continue to have a space? I'll leave my reflections there, and I will now pass on to my colleague, Dr. Jill Buck.
Thank you very much, Joan, and thanks everyone for inviting me today. Very happy to be here. I've wrote down to introduce myself as a social work researcher from the University of Chester in England, which is my job. And I am currently working on a large scale study of lived experience in the UK and Ireland, which is one of the reasons I'm here. But I think on the back of what you've just said, it's also important to say that prior to this, I was a social worker in a very deprived area of Merseyside for about 10 years with young people in conflict with the law. And I think one of the pathways that led me here is the fact that those young people understood in their minds and bodies all of the heaviness of the system that was on them and all of the pathways into why they were in trouble, but very rarely were they properly listened to or seen to have any wisdom. So kind of instinctively, I knew there was something we were missing as professionals in terms of our understanding, and how could we turn this round so that that wisdom could be embedded in our learning. Now, I don't have lived experience of criminalisation myself, but I do work with wonderful colleagues who do, as paid researchers, visiting lecturers and co-authors. And their insights really bring a depth of knowledge that is far beyond what I could offer alone as a social worker or a researcher. In just the next 5 minutes, I'm going to offer some brief placing of what you're going to hear from my colleagues in historical and empirical context. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the history in the UK and Ireland and a little bit of the empirical evidence. Criminal justice systems in many countries, as many of you will know, are overcrowded, unsafe, unequal and ineffective. In England and Wales, high reoffending costs about £18 billion annually, while substance-related deaths and suicides in prison continue to rise. And multiple international policies encourage people's active participation in the services that are impacting them. So we've got the European prison rules that actively encourage prisoner consultation, and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that advance inclusive participatory decision-making in justice. One really promising area, as I see it, of this kind of participatory practice is peer-led criminal justice, where people draw on lived experience to support others who are navigating similar challenges to them. Here in the Netherlands, this term is often experiential peers, you might have heard, who are people who are active in mental health and forensic settings, supporting others who are experiencing similar challenges. But across the world, Criminalised people make contributions as service providers, as leaders, council representatives, policy advisors, researchers and authors. And evidence indicates that these participatory approaches have real potential. They can spark innovative service provision, support people in moving away from crime, reduce harmful substance use, and even prevent suicide. There is also a really long and overlooked history of people with lived experience shaping justice reform and service provision. If I use England and the UK as an example, in the 1700s, John Howard, a very famous prison reformer, was also a prisoner of war in his earlier life. And he was motivated to get into prison reform because he'd witnessed abuses firsthand within prison systems. And he went on to inspect prisons across England, reporting corruption and inhuman conditions. He went on to co-author a national policy abolishing jailers' fees and improving conditions for people across the country. In 1813, a group of African-American prisoners in Dartmoor Prison in England built a whole recreational community, co-facilitating education, sport, music, dramatic productions, including Shakespearean plays. In 1836, another famed penal reformer, Elizabeth Fry, asked women in prison who they would trust to teach their children, who were often imprisoned with them. They nominated their fellow detainees, and prisoner-led education that followed was so successful that the school prospered beyond all expectation. Fast forward to the 20th century, in 1949, a prisoner known as Danny C. helped to establish Narcotics Anonymous from detention in North America. What began as a grassroots support group has grown into a global mutual aid network with more than 58,000 meetings across 131 countries. And back in the UK, between the 1980s and the early 2000s, we had former prisoner colleagues like Chris Tchaikovsky, Mark Johnson, Mark Leach, and Paula Harriott, who've developed organisations that still shape policy today. From Women in Prison to Use a Voice and Unlock, which you can look up online, each drew on their lived experiences to build collective voice, innovative interventions, and campaigns for alternatives to excluding penal practices. Now, just before I finish, I want to note that alongside these achievements, there are challenges. We've got tokenism, which still exists, undermining expertise, when people are consulted but excluded from real decision-making power, including being able to be employed or to travel. Exploitation arises when people are asked to share often traumatic experiences without adequate support or compensation, making people's well-being a priority. And representation is still really uneven. So women, people who are racially minoritized, and people living with disabilities are often underrepresented in these spaces. So in summary, lived experience has long shaped humanising practices and penal reform. Our challenge now is to ensure that participation today is not only centred, but inclusive, meaningful and transformative.
Excellent. Well, I suppose it's over to me now. So just to introduce myself, my name's Scott Kidd. I'm a lecturer in criminology, and I'm also a member of a group called Experience for Justice Collective, which is a collective of individuals with lived experience, academics with lived experience, practitioners with lived experience, and people that have no lived experience. And what we do is we come collectively together to challenge and basically to address social justice issues that aren't getting enough airtime or being looked at enough. So I think that's something quite important to mention. But also, I'm an individual that actually comes to this with my own lived experience of the criminal justice system. I have served 11 and a half years myself in prison. And what I've basically done is I've chosen to take that experience and kind of like move forward so that voices are heard. And today, what I'm going to be speaking to is some of the evaluation work that I've done with the police, with His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, local authorities and that kind of thing. And I have to be careful that I'm not too specific because certain things will kind of held to account where we're not allowed to mention specifics. So I'm just going to try to summarise it all together. So even when we're in these spaces and when we've carried out these evaluations, we still have challenges in actually sort of delivering that message forward. So I'd like to kind of like say that when I speak about lived experience, I'm not just talking about testimony or anecdote. Lived experience is knowledge. It's knowledge written into people's lives. It's formed in the immediacy of struggle. It is knowledge of their resilience. It is knowledge of their own survival. their stories, those things, that experience. And this knowledge is knowledge that theory and detached observation alone cannot capture. I think it's very important to say that, because as a criminologist, I can look at all the theories in the world, but does that really speak to someone's real lived experience of it? I don't think so. And I think only having those voices represented actually gives you that true insight. But it's not enough just to kind of listen to it. You have to actually immerse it and involve it. So for me, it matters profoundly for penal reform. And I thought I'd kind of put a penal reform kind of note to this, because obviously we're here with Penal Reform International. So thank you ever so much for the invitation. Because when reform is designed only from a top above approach, it risks in a sense becoming technocratic. It becomes detached. And when something is detached, it's ultimately ineffective. So we don't have that effectiveness. But when lived experience is actually centered in that process, reform becomes grounded. It becomes grounded in those experiences of resilience. It comes grounded in those experiences of struggle, and it also comes grounded in those experiences of survival. Okay. And with that, it becomes humane, but it also becomes effective. So it takes away that ineffectiveness and then obviously realigns it in an effective way. I've seen this clearly in the evaluations that I've worked on, from the police, working with strategic leads, policymakers, probation staff, service providers, but ultimately the people themselves that have been involved with the criminal justice system, the people that have that very knowledge that I mentioned just a few moments ago. One thing that's always clearly stood out to me is if you embed people with lived experience in any form of process, you actually improve trust. And this improved trust is something that leads to more positive engagement, but it also improves people's outcomes. People I've spoken to on a number of different evaluations have said, I'd rather speak to someone who's been through it because they actually get it. They understand me. And what that does is that actually goes toward building authenticity. It builds credibility. And when you have credibility, when you have authenticity, it takes that reluctant compliance that a lot of people feel towards systems, and it actually changes it to genuine engagement. Because if people get you, you feel like you want to engage with it. Yeah. So for me, that genuine engagement is something that ultimately leads towards reducing reoffending. And that's what the whole penal system's about. It's meant to be reducing reoffending. So if you have something there that could actually help with that, why aren't we using it more? Why is it not embedded more? But the real strength of lived experience lies in its collective power. It's in the delivery that we see. We see it with peer mentors. We see it with staff that are now working in these spaces that have lived experience. And it's this community of voices that shape the design of services. And this is something I've noticed. But then again, it's not just about being tokenistic. It's about using those lived experience to how we change how services are run, how we make them more accessible, how we build trust across a whole system. And there's a trust usually that a lot of people don't trust in. So by imploring lived experience and actually having it involved properly in a co-produced way, actually working together collectively, we can make those changes. And this collective lived experience, in my view, from what I've actually observed and actually reviewed from some evaluations that went over several years and that, is that if the actual collective lived experience translates into real policy change. Our sort of evaluation showed that lived experience perspective shaped commissioning decisions, expanded trauma-informed practice, it strengthened peer mentoring networks, and it influenced how engagement was structured. So, for example, when we move towards voluntary engagement, which we found produces better outcomes than things like enforced attendance, this was all backed by lived experience voices and experiences. So when those voices were actually there, we actually had people that were wanting to attend. It wasn't just because they had to be there or they were being forced to do it. It became voluntary and they were wanting to be part of that journey, which I think is really quite powerful. So for me, the evidence is clear. When lived experience is embedded, services become more humane. They become more authentic, and ultimately they become more effective. They help people feel supported rather than managed, and they give individuals, and in terms of probation staff, providers, authorities, etc., the tools that actually work in practice. So if you've got individuals that can make the tools work in practice, why are we not using those people in partnership to make that practice happen? So this, in a sense, is how lived experience drives not only better outcomes, but also reduces reoffending, which we all think is a good thing for society. If you change these things, employing that experience, I think definitely moves that way. So I think kind of to sort of like sum it up is my message today is that lived experience is not a side note in reform. It's both a bridge and a compass. It's a bridge between personal realities and systemic change. and it's a compass that orientates policy towards dignity, justice, and belonging. So I think if we're actually going to sit down here and sort of have these conversations, and if we're serious about penal reform, which I think we all are, I think we should be, because we're all sat here, we have this interest. I think reform that delivers real change, then lived experience cannot remain at the margins. It's something that must be at the centre. It's something that must guide us. It's something that should be there challenging us and also remind us that reform is about people. And that is the thing that I'd like to say. It's about people, not just about a system. And that probably brings me to the end of my kind of conversation and discussion on this point. I'd like to pass over to my colleague, Hemming.
Hi, good morning, everyone. If you don't mind, I'm going to move a bit. I don't want to feel rude with me back behind people, so I'm going to be a booster. As I said, good morning, everyone. I'm Kemi Ryan, and I'm one of the founders of Reform Development, which is a community interest company that works on prevention and the aftermath of crime. I also have a lived experience. When I was 19, I was incarcerated for an importation and was given 8 years. I served 4 years and 3 months before gaining in parole. My experience and what I bring to the lived experience is that my organisation was born out of the lack of opportunities and disadvantage. I felt and found on my release as a young offender at the time that the services didn't fit the needs. And I was actually told, I speak about this quite briefly, I was told in 2007, because that's when I got released, by the way, it's been a long journey. I was told in 2007 to have some babies, to gain housing, because I'm coming from a background of disadvantage. You see, I don't hide, and I'm very proud of where I'm coming from and where I am now. That actually really disheartened me. But the choice I had is, do I listen or do I do my own thing? And I was still young, very ambitious, blood running through my veins, could feel them every day. And I didn't want to let that go. So I did some voluntary work, went along the way of, trying to get myself together. That didn't work out, discriminated. Anytime it come to the employment payments was never there. So myself and a colleague decided to set up Reform Development. Now, within my organisation, we focus on therapeutic support because my element is disadvantage. So we have the criminal justice system, but we have different pockets of it. Some people are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, some people are coming from privilege. Jail to me is, I call it a cocktail, because if you don't know, you will assume it's just disadvantage, but we know it's broader. We have bankers, teachers, disadvantage. We have a cocktail of it. My cocktail, within that cocktail is focused on disadvantage. It's focused on, if you look at the figures of reoffending, it's mainly due to disadvantage because poverty is a crime. So a lot of people we work with are traumatized because of childhood and then unfortunately developing in criminal activity and behaviour. So my organisation focuses on the lived experience, but it focuses on allowing the individual to see wings, to be able to be self-reliant. Because what I found in my journey in the beginning when I was being discriminated is I felt like I was never listened to. I felt like I was sat in front of someone who couldn't understand me, but yet was telling me what to do. I felt that I was actually being re-traumatized by going through the situation that I'd already been through and had already passed. So what our organisation does regarding lived experience is it allows individuals to have the time to think about who they are, because I think it's important. I know there's a big emphasis on get a job, but that's not, I don't believe that's the way. I do eventually, this is a process. And I believe by saying get a job in the beginning, we're actually causing more damage to the individual when we're talking about the arena and my part's disadvantage. Because we have to remember that the cocktail, when people say, oh, reoffending and someone with a record, we have to remember it's individuality. but because of the system and how it's made up, everyone gets put into the box. And I just think it's so important that we are aware of the client set of individuals we're working with, so we know how to deal and we know how to walk through the process and not damage. So with the lived experience, and my message to everyone is a therapeutic one. It's to be very aware. Sometimes we're too focused on the individual because the individual's got the problems. I think us as professionals, because my thing is I was a service user and now I'm a service provider. And what I've learned and picked up through the process of that is I think it's important as the professional to understand the lived experience, because the damage that's caused unsubconsciously. So this is not damage that's done on purpose. So I don't want no one to feel like this is a purpose thing, because I know sometimes people can feel a bit, unhardened when, but it's all in subconscious because we don't know enough information on it, if that makes sense. And I just want to leave a message by saying to be mindful when we're working with people. We're all human beings, we all have feelings, and if we're looking at process and rehabilitation within the criminal justice system, we have to remember we all play a part, but our part, even importantly, is to get character right and behaviour with individuals. That is the only way of progress going through. But out that progress going through, we will find reoffending. We will find the work that we've done becomes nothing. And when I say it becomes not, and I'm not saying that lightly, because I know everyone plays their part within rehabilitation, but if it's not understood and it's not done properly, that work will become nothing for the individual. So my message is therapeutic, understanding, and it's actually our responsibility to learn more about the individual rather than us always telling the individual. So I'll leave it as that, everyone. Thank you very much.
Done.
So yeah, thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks to PRI for organising. I'm just delighted to be part of this discussion this morning. I'm Donna Arundel. I'm based on the south coast of England at the University of Southampton. I'm actually an interdisciplinary scholar currently in the public health team, and a large proportion of my work is with women who are imprisoned and also women who are given community orders. And with some of these women, I also work with their children. So my direct experience linked to this and everywhere I go is that I am now an adult of childhood maternal imprisonment. So when I was little, my mum was in and out of prison multiple times. And I kind of want to start with, yes, big picture of this. So I'm taking us to the indirect experience, right? I want to start big picture, just some numbers, bring us in. We know that 1.4 million children globally have a mum who's incarcerated. Of those, it's estimated at 19,000 children are detained with their mums in prison. And then to my UK context, the UK government actually doesn't collect data. They don't count the numbers, but last year they did for the first time calculate an estimation, and they think informed estimation of 192,000 children have either a mother or a father in prison. So I make that point to say understanding the numbers of the scale is obviously just the first step. We want to really understand what about direct, indirect lived experience. What can that do for policymakers, for more effective policymaking in this space for penal reform? Okay. And I would say, first and foremost, this is about, you could take it from the angle of data quality. What you do in bringing in indirect and direct lived experience is you can have that knowledge produced as close to the source of the policy issue at stake that cannot be paralleled by other fantastic modes of knowledge production. We can also think about it from policy blind spots. Again, back to this point, brilliant brains around the world working in penal reform, best of education, best of intentions, really sharp analysis is happening. But direct and indirect lived experience can bolster this work that's happening. And so, yeah, policy blind spots are a risk factor in policy making. They emerge despite best efforts, and using the expertise of a whole host of people, whether it's direct or indirect, can really help us do better in terms of policy reform. So to give a substantive example of how policy has benefited from indirect lived experience in this specific space of children being impacted by maternal incarceration, bit of a mouthful. UK context again, taking you to Scotland, many of you might know there's progressive work happening there. So they now have implemented, the government have approved and have begun to roll out child impact assessments. And child impact assessments help the authorities, help practitioners understand the needs of the children who are impacted at the point that a parent encounters the criminal legal system. So perhaps astonishingly, this does not happen as standard. You know, this is thought of as progressive, and Scotland have co-created these child impact assessments with experts by experience, and the government have now shifted policy at the local level, benefiting from that direct lived experience expertise. And just to take you globally, okay, zoom from Scotland to the global, we have the wonderful organisation Children of Prisoners of Europe, COPE. You may have seen the briefing paper on how we can bring about compassionate sentencing. One of the key components there is implementation of child impact assessments, and this is strong advocacy work is happening, and Scotland have evidenced the value of lived experience in rolling this out, and this could be piloted globally. So I think my takeaway for everyone is the added value of lived experience expertise. Just another framing of what people have said already is, if you think of it from a technical policy making perspective, it's a policy solution in a sense. We can really mitigate against policy blind spots by bolstering the excellent knowledge and data that's already being created. That's me.
I'll just, I'm Paula Harriott, so I'm the CEO currently at Unlock, but I've had a long history of working over the last 17 years in building participatory frameworks for people who are directly impacted and indirectly impacted by children in particular, by the criminal legal system in the UK. My passion for this work really stems from my own period of imprisonment. I got an 8-year prison sentence for drugs in 2004. And having lived through that, you know, you learn so much about what does it feel like to be on the other side of state power. As a white woman, you know, educated with privilege, you don't normally experience that. You sort of have a free ride through some of the discrimination that people of colour will experience, or, you know, people who don't fit the mould. And I think that really has been the driving, so the personal pain of the separation from my 5 children, but also the witnessing that state power is not benevolent, but actually has a deep malevolence within it, and understanding what it feels like to be a person who's not protected by the state, but is punished by the state. And that totally shapes the way you view the world. And I see it now as a liberation. I see that through reflection on that experience, you are liberated from these notions that everything is okay, basically, and all we need to do is tinker at the edges to reform it. So actually, maybe what we need is a radical overhaul for future forward thinking about how we build worlds and communities, how we build our societies around principles of fairness. What is fairness? Who decides what fairness is? How do we look at global drugs trade? How do, you know, like think of all the issues that impacted on my transition into that space. These give you lots of opportunities to free your mind to thinking about what alternatives can bring. And I think one thing that people with lived experience, with support and with building the infrastructure to support is that people can be imaginative, creative, because they also are rejecting what is. If you reject what is, it forces you to think of what could be. Whereas when you live in a society where you're okay, you might not see the necessity to think outside of the box. That's why I love creatives. I love, you know, if you think about people in prison, so many artists, so many creatives, you know, harnessing that creativity for our future forward thinking is really critical. That would be my perspective. I've come out of prison in 2008 and really wanted to do something in this space, and so I've been working consistently. And thank you to Jill for the honouring of that contribution. I thought that I would just summarise, if that's okay. I've made some notes. So anybody who I don't get it right, you know, let me know. But I mean, Dwayne, lovely Dwayne from Australia, gave us a definition of lived experience, thinking about the components of lived experience, embodiment, embodied knowledge, the notion in epistemic injustice, that there is an ecology of knowledges in the world. We quite often frame our actions and our activism based on that which we already know, but we don't, and that tends to be, you know, in the hierarchy of knowledge production, academia, policy, the types of language, you know, the objectivity rather than the subjective experience. We read Miranda Fricker on that. She talks about epistemic injustice, how these types of mindsets prevent us from like valuing that which is embodied, that which is feeling. Feminist writing really suggests that we lean into that as well for innovation and creativity and reimagining. So I think useful proximity, really important, reflective. And he talked about epistemic justice, but also about the notion of creating something that is healing justice. You know, what is healing? You know, I think people with lived experience are damaged by contact with the criminal justice system. It is a grave decision to send someone to prison. It is a lifelong shadow. There's no coming back from it. It has, like, you know, I can't go to the US. You know, there are, you know, it damages you psychologically, it damages your relationships with your children. The state does that. Grave decision. So what I think 100% the lived experience movement, both in the UK and globally, is calling for a healing justice system. And I think Kemi, I've jumped to Kemi because Kemi talked a lot about the therapeutic nature of her work, the discrimination that she faced as a woman of colour coming out of prison. Kemi, weirdly, and I were in prison together on the same landing.
Yeah.
Imagine that, years later, you meet in a different space. The beautiful nature of that. But actually we shared a landing on the prison for a few years together. So Kemi's talked about the therapeutic nature of her work. I think that poverty is a crime. That when you go to prison, you see, even though there's a real diversity of people who end up in prison, but a driving connective thread is poverty. And the clear need for, you know, something deeper than let's get you into work and that's not the answer. You know, the answer, yeah, it's an aspect of the resolution, but the deepest pain that is caused by imprisonment requires therapeutic support. There is things called post-incarceration syndrome. These are deep emotional scars, and especially for women separated from children. You know, our work needs to be deeply therapeutic and not transactional. I think people with lived experience are talking about relational work all the time. We want relational work, and all we get is transactional work. So, we talked about the PTSD. Okay. Going then to Jill. Jill's talked beautifully about there's an evidence base for people with lived experience. Historically, we've been change makers. John Howard in the UK, founder of the Howard League for Penal Reform, founder of the Howard Journal, one of the most well-respected peer-reviewed journals in research. This is the legacy of his experience of going to prison. So people with lived experience have been creating change through history. Yet we are invisibilized in the narratives about prison reform. And we want to claim that back. And I think that's, you know, in terms of epistemic justice, in terms of whose knowledge counts, where is our legacy, where is our history, where's the richness of our history in terms of our strengths, because we're consistently framed as vulnerable, you know, in need of correction, in need of compliance, you know, like the deficits that lead us into these spaces become our singular identity, where there is a duality about identity. That is, and then there's always a duality around strengths, weaknesses. Everybody has them, but for us, as in quite often in terms of penal reform, and in these spaces of the criminal legal system, our primary and singular identity is that of weakness, of that of you know, non-compliance, and that's a labeling that makes reintegration really, really difficult. In some ways, it justifies holding us askance and rather than bringing us in. So labeling theory is something to really think about as well, and the use of language that we use. So Jill reminds us of our rich history, which strengthens our ambition as change makers and activists to know that we come from this lineage. And I think Jill talks about, you know, the risks of tokenism, exploitation and representation that we as the lived experience movement need to organise for. So I think that part of this work, it's not really us begging people to help us. It's about rejecting the notions of learned helplessness as well as individuals who've been incarcerated, to be able to say we actually can be activists and change makers in this space as well. And then we learn how to communicate that and strengthen our own ambition to do that. So to guard against the risks of exploitation and to be talking about and doing work around our own diversity of representation in our own networks and frameworks. Scott beautifully brought us into the importance when you have within changing policy, building the evidence base, that the integration of people into lived experience in meaningful ways absolutely deepens and richens the evidence base that we can develop in his work on evaluation. He's talked about humane and effective system is one of the key asks of people that you've engaged with, and that trust. Building, if you really want to build effective evidence base, which is what people call, or policymakers are leaning into, we want the evidence base. We also have to understand that the evidence base without the integration of people with lived experience will be a replication of existing knowledge. So in the terms of knowledge creation and building Foucault's theory around discourse, how do we build alternative discourse? We have to be diversifying the variety of voices and the methodologies by which the research is created. If we lean into existing knowledge production methodologies, we only get a replication of the same knowledge. It's in the expansion of participatory methods that we broaden our understanding in deep listening. And people with lived experience will only trust in those processes to share knowledge if they feel that the values of the people who are asking the questions align in terms of authenticity, connectivity, relation. You know, we are people who do not easily trust. So for people to come into spaces to engage with us, you have to be the people that make changes. So that's Scott summarising. Scott, have I done justice?
As always.
And then finally, just for Donna to reiterate, these are the key points I heard, Donna, is that there are policy blind spots all the time, you know, and in a way, people with lived experience are like the mirror on your car, you know, the wingman. that you have to glance into at the corner of your eye. Because if you're only focused on what's straight ahead, you're going to miss that car that's going to come and hit you on the motorway. We are the people who can augment and enlighten the policy blind spots. It's very important that you dedicate your time to thinking about that. And you gave an excellent example of how integration of people with lived experience, listening to the voices of children by a beautiful researcher, Sarah Beresford, with whom I worked at the Prison Reform Trust, has created an immense policy change, along with a lot of activism from, you know, mothers of imprisoned, mothers who've had children whilst they've been imprisoned, you know, and advocacy groups internationally raising the idea about how important it is to capture to do something about the children of imprisoned parents. And it's in the UK government, in the Labour government, it was in the Labour manifesto to start to count the children of imprisoned parents. So this feels to me like a success of how collective organising around an issue can ultimately affect a change. Whether it will be the change we want, let's see. But you know, it gives us hope that by building collective alliances, we can move forward. Donna's talked about the importance of proximity. It's the importance of getting close to the issue. You can't do this work around creating effective policy change in an abstract. It requires you to get close. And I think it's also like really committing to this notion that people with lived experience are knowledge producers. This experience creates knowledge. It's the way we listen and ask the questions that from which the knowledge emerges. So making space in policy making for that is critical. Is that everybody?
Yes.
Just didn't want to. So I just thought I'd summarise my feelings. I think that this work around lived experience ultimately takes place, challenges notions of moral neutrality. Think that if you want to change things for better, it requires us all to interrogate our own positionality. It requires us also to really think about, this is not a morally neutral space, especially when we talk about people who've been to prison, people who've harmed society, people who have done things that we perceive to be harmful. That it requires us to examine our own moral frameworks. It requires us to dig deep into those, because you cannot build authentic relationships without doing that work. This is about shifting power. This work is ultimately about shifting power. It's about saying, we're not the experts. It's not like we're the experts and we want a bit of your help. That's not really it either. That's tinkering. Recognizing problems requires collective actions, collective organising, and to be able to collectively work together, we need to know why we're there, what our red lines are, where we're not going to go and where we're prepared to go. It's a psychological mindset that people need to develop in this space of working with people with lived experience, and the people with lived experience need to do that work too. It's not like, you know, it's not, I'm not saying everybody, we've all got to work together, and that requires us all to do this collective psychological work on ourselves. It requires us to listen as much as to challenge. You know, 2 ears, 1 mouth, more listening than speaking sometimes. You know, so deeply listening, deeply trying to interrogate what truth really means in these moments. And I think that also to understand that the solutions for resolving these intractable problems that feel really difficult to even start, can start in small steps. Small steps is fine. You know, small steps might be illuminating, transformational moments. But generally, in my experience, change, just as change in individuals, is incremental and painstaking. Also, changing systems, changing mindsets, building alternative discourse. These things we make contributions to those movements of change. Every little step matters in terms of a contribution. So I would exhort people to have patience, but also to act with deep commitment to values that will sustain them through the difficulties. And yeah, so I'm going to end on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, everybody. You got a snapshot of the various works that we do in the lived experience space, and you can see just how broad and how diverse our perspectives are. And in each way, we hopefully contribute to this healing justice idea, to this idea that we are co-partners and co-leaders in the penal reform work that happens globally. And hopefully in your work, you can see the value that we bring to the table, and that you'll continue to advocate for us. I think one thing that Paula touched on was that, we're not here to take over the space. We want to share the space as a community, but we need those in places of power, places, organizations that can make change to be able to share the stage with us and for us to work together as a community. But I'll leave it there and I will hand back to Raoul.
Yes, can I have an applause for this group, please? Yes, thank you so much all for sharing your story, your personal story. I've listened with an open mouth, as we say in Dutch. So right now we wanted to move to the Dutch participants, and they're all behind you. And before we go to the Q&A, so there's the Q&A after, let's say, 30-40 minutes, but first of all, just give some space for Dutch reflections.
Yes.
And I wanted to start with Khalil, because I think Khalil's organization resembles in some ways the organizations that were here. So maybe just reflecting on lived experience. You can stay there, I think, reflecting on your experience, working with lived experience, challenges, achievements, risks. Maybe 5 minutes, you can share your reflection.
Me myself, I have experience as well. Formerly, my sentence will end in a couple of months. So I recognize a lot of what most participants have said, and I experienced it myself. The thing that I would like to think and add a bit about is also because we work with people with lived experience, actually who want to become someone with lived experience. So when they're in prison or right out of prison, like they approach us and we help them to develop themselves and get a position into society so they can do that in a productive manner. So also we need to protect ourselves against ourselves, and in a way as people with lived experience. Because sometimes you think when you come out of prison, you want to contribute, society's changed, you are changed, and you walk against walls, and then it's really important to find someone who's next to you, who can guide you, help you to grow yourself. So it's not only that we need to fight for a position with for people with different experience into society. We need also to help and support each other in that and growth. And we during our experiences with the Stichting Studio, we also started to make a difference between people with lived experience and people we call them experienced experts. Someone who has tools, expertise, and they add their lived experience is like a plus on their resume with all the skills and abilities that they already or education that they bring. And we make a difference with people with lived experience. Those are the people who tell their stories, and those are the people who share the trauma sometimes. And it's really important. What we do is we speak about them. You cannot take that as an identity. You are not your trauma. You are not just the prison sentence. You are more than that. And we try to use that. Sometimes you don't have any opportunities besides that. We try to use that as an opportunity, as a step up to get to another place, another career, another life. So that's the thing that I just want. We need to support each other, and I think if you think about that lived experience, that doesn't become an identity on itself. Because we are all more than just an experience.
Thank you, Khalil. We invited more people, Dutch people with lived experience. One member of the global group called Malcolm. He wanted to come, but he had to work. So sorry, he couldn't be here. We also invited Young Perspectives. I thought they were going to be here. Just acknowledging the important work they've done in the Netherlands. They're still doing in the Netherlands, working in youth detention. And maybe next, as the co-organizer, Liliana, maybe you can reflect on including lived experience and what you think of the whole story of her.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Lilian Ploemen. I work with Bureau Clara Wichmann. We do strategic litigation on gender issues. I have a background in politics and in activism. I'm a feminist activist, and as all of you know, we live that experience, and that has helped us build our movement and bring about change. One of the issues that I'm working on is related to women in prison in the Netherlands, where we've been approached to engage with women with lived experience to redress what their experience was, because I mean, lived experience is like you've been all relating to that, it has a big prism of different experiences. And so there is the experience of losing your freedom to move around as such. And then there's lived experiences within the detention and criminal justice system that would also not be acceptable outside of the criminal system. And this is where we've been engaging in, working from an intersectional perspective with women who have been relating to us their experiences with gender-based violence within the prison system, where they've been sexually assaulted, raped by guards, and have not been, and had related their experience of not being heard, not feeling safe to share that experience, let alone to call out. And so this, of course, has been deeply traumatic. I don't need to explain to any of us here, both the events as such, and the fact that the powerlessness that you experience being within the criminal justice system has been, like, you know, exacerbated by this experience and not being heard. They have also been relating to us their perspective of what needs to change when it comes to healthcare in the criminal justice system. And like you, I can talk about this hours, but I'm just going to point out that we have felt it as our responsibility, because they have approached us, called on us to be their voice. And this is something I don't say lightly, because, you know, the fact that, you know, I don't want you to be my voice because you have a voice and I have a voice. Fact is that when you're within the system, that voice was not heard. And so we've been trying to bring the perspective of lived experiences through the way that, you know, we relate it into the system. And so the people who are sitting behind me work within the system, and they have been listening to us. I think it was like a process that was not easy in the beginning, but I think the dialogue that we've developed has really brought about changes. And of course, it was not only that dialogue. There's other people here who can relate how they have contributed. And I do think that lived experiences have become, compared to like a couple of years ago, have become more the source of knowledge that you've been explaining to us that it is. And I think that that's a really great step forward. In closing, I would say the biggest leap is that within the criminal justice system, there is now this understanding that the system has been built in a gendered way. It has been organized around male detainees. And the understanding that for women, people who identify as women, trans people, I mean, the diversity that we have, that you might need to take a different approach has really a solid base now and is being discussed as maybe Toon, you want to relate to that. There's like within the system, also at a political level, there is this understanding now. And so I would say that building on lived experience as a knowledge base is the way to drive the new system, so to say, forward. And I do hope that we will, continue to be able to engage that knowledge. And thanks to all of you to again, enlighten my own understanding also of the sources that lived experiences can bring and how people who do not have that experience can relate to that. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liliana, for sharing that. And maybe you pointed already out.
Yeah, sorry, don't
Probably
to just pretend that you're not there. So
So there is the Dutch custodial institution agency, right? The Ministry of Justice, Toon and Francesca and Joke. Maybe you can reflect on what you've heard.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I invite my colleagues to answer what I say, but we are here to just listen and to understand what the lived experiences here are. So thank you for what you told us, and I think it's also very brave to do so because for many people who have been in prison, it's also a shame to talk about it. And yeah, I think it's very powerful to express what you experienced, and it can help to make also better policies. So yeah, just me state that's my most important statement here. So to say, it's quite hard to improve a system like the prison system. Of course, we listen to a lot of people, but we are in a context of politics, of what society thinks of us and how a prison system should be. And that's not new. You also told about John Howard, the experience in the 18th century already. So what we are looking at almost every day, and we now even have a special program to redesign our regimes, especially also the female regime, is where our policy window is to do so. So we now have a very complex situation in the Netherlands in politics, but that can also be a chance because maybe we have some months coming that not everyone is looking at the prison system.
Right.
I hope so.
Yeah.
And it can also be a chance to do some reforms, and lived experience is very important, but also inside experience as well. People who are still in prison, victims, volunteers can have other views on what we do and have other roles because, and that's maybe also one thing to add. We as staff, prison staff, we have a uniform, and I think if you're in a vulnerable position that you are in prison, it's very hard to receive help and guidance from experts who have the how did you call it, the state powers. So it's for us, it's again and again important to realize that. So yeah, I hope that we can improve still a little bit more. I don't think that the Netherlands is too bad if you look into the prison conditions and also the attitudes of staff. But incidents happen, and we should handle with that. And also we should recognize, especially what Liliana said. We still see, for example, female corrections as just we put it as a male product.
Mhm.
And that's too bad. And the research you did, you have to tell something about it. It's very
Yeah.
important for us because it's independent. It states very intellectual, good statements,
Yeah.
how to reform this. And we are about to do so. So we also listen to those academics who do that very, very good work.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could I come back on?
Later, is that okay?
Yeah.
We have a few people
Okay,
that-
good.
because-
Another point, yeah.
because actually
A good point.
Okay.
Tone has pointed out to the next one I want to invite, so I'm not needed anymore. Yara, you're doing work, you made a research about the women's prisons, you're from the University of Leiden.
Yeah.
Can you share something about your reflections?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the kind words, Toon. Yeah, we, together with my colleague Esther van Ginneke, I work as a PhD candidate for Leiden University. We conducted quite a large scale research on social safety in women's prisons. It was commissioned by the Dutch Prison Service because there were cases of sexual misconduct in the prisons. And then we interviewed 150 people in prison, both incarcerated individuals and staff. And we focused on the concept of social safety in a very broad manner. We focused on gender, on sexuality, on the way in which incarcerated individuals interact with each other, how staff interact with the incarcerated individuals, and vice versa. And we really try to show the social processes that are present in prison. And the concept of power was already mentioned. And one of the main things that we found was that staff can feel very uncomfortable with the concept of power or having power, with wearing a uniform, with a lot of people wouldn't even acknowledge the fact that they have the power because they have the keys. And so we really try to create space for all the perspectives in prison. And so now we're building on that research actually, and I'm specifically interested in marginalized groups within prison. And so I'm focusing on the position of transgender persons, non-binary people, intersex people, and where they can or should be placed, where they would feel comfortable. There's been a lot of discussion politically about that as well. But the way in which the prison system is currently built, it's a binary system. We separate women and men. But maybe the system like that isn't fit for purpose anymore or doesn't benefit everyone. So that's what I'm currently focusing on. I don't have lived experience myself. I'm really trying to be a good ethnographic researcher, although that can be quite hard when you don't have the lived experience yourself. But I will be spending a lot of time in prison again, trying to gain as much knowledge as I can. And I think, we advise the Dutch prison system to, look at the system in a different manner and see if there's alternatives. And one of the recommendations that we did was including peer support within the system, and also including people with lived experience in the supervisory committee that every prison has. So we really try to see what the alternatives are within the context that's currently there. So if you have any ideas, please tell me, because there's so much research to be done still. So, thank you.
Talking about research,
Yeah.
there's another researcher, Hadassah. If you can give your reflection about the topic.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's super interesting. I'm a philosopher. And I do not have any lived experience. So what I'm doing in my research, I focus on imprisonment and prison labor. And I believe that lived experience is extremely important, especially in this field. Traditionally, scholarship on prison labor has been framed through a lens of rehabilitation. So the underlying idea of rehabilitation is that you exclude people and then you rehabilitate them, or reintegrate them. And the the rights people have in prison are all focused on this reintegration. It's not focused on integration into society at that moment, but on reintegration. And in my work, I challenge these conventional philosophical frameworks that justify exclusion and then rehabilitation. And what I do is I'm developing a framework for considering prison labor based on integration, based on societal inclusion. And I believe that to achieve with societal participation, access to meaningful prison labor or meaningful prison work opportunities during incarceration. So not only after incarceration, but during incarceration is really important. And it's of course only an aspect of participation in society. But I think it's an important aspect, at least in societies we live in, that are so much focused on work and participation in the labor market. Meaningful work, it's really high standards. It's not breaking rocks or holding matchboxes or something. It's a higher standard. Like the traditional focus is on decent work, so non-exploitation. But meaningful work is a higher standard, and I believe this is really important, not only for skill building, for long-term reintegration, but also because it constitutes participation in society. Being able to participate in the labor market during imprisonment constitutes participation in society. So in that respect, it differs from rehabilitation. It's habilitation, it's not rehabilitation. So the focus is on present participation, not on future participation. So why is lived experience so important? Because I think we need, or at least I need to understand what meaningful work is and what truly helps people be part of society. So I'm here basically to learn and to listen to all of you. And to tell you a little bit about my project, but basically here to listen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adasa. Veronique from Rescaled, can you share? I know you've published recently a document about lived experience as well. Your take the organization on the topic. Maybe you can share your reflections about today and the topic of lived experience.
Yeah. Thank you for the beautiful things that were said before me. I wrote a lot down. Admiring as well. So I work for Reskill, which is a European movement for small scale forms of detention. When you're talking about examples, women in prison in Scotland doing amazing things with community custody units, saying like we shouldn't put women in prison anymore because they often have severe trauma. So let's put them in small scale houses where they are part of society. And I wouldn't say that I acknowledge the prison system is built for men, but it's not it's built for no one. It's not it's for a reason that Elizabeth Fry, John Howard, Clara Wigman wrote amazing things about change, not prison reform, but justice reform. Not put people in prison, but we keep them part of society. And I think that's the core idea we do Reskilled as well when we're talking about people with experience, acknowledging people for who they are, understanding their context, which you mentioned before as well. So thank you for that. Not only seeing them as individuals and taking away knowledge from them, but also seeing them as in their complexity of their identities, because yes, they have knowledge, but they can also maybe still have trauma and harm people even after they leave prisons. And we do as well as professionals. So we try to do good, but we do harm as well while trying to do the good thing. So, and I have to say I'm here also with a little bit mixed feelings. I'm a child, my father was in prison for attacking my mother. So I have seen and I'm the oldest of 4 children. I've seen from very close up the harm being done by the justice system, but also by people with lived experience, but also by victims to their children and also the children growing up with trauma. So I think, yeah, talking about living, for me, it's a way of acknowledging each other as human beings and vice versa. So, yeah. Just would like to leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Veronique,
Thank
for your
you.
contribution. I think we have landed at the question and answer stage. I don't know how we do that. Maybe we just raise an hand and whoever.
I guess
You wanna ask a question? Yeah, please. Go ahead.
About how you can improve the prison system. I was reflecting on my work in that space. So I was head of programs, like founding member of the User Voice in the UK, which was the very first in 2009, the very first lived experience led organisation that started to work very closely with the prison service about how do you build participatory frameworks to inform the improvement of the service. And one of the mechanisms that we used was this idea of prison councils. So how do you, talking about meaningful integration, how do you create sort of civil rights for people within prison? Just because we don't have the vote as people in prison in the UK, you're restricted from voting. But how can you create some mechanism for democratic participation in the service design and the service improvement? So the idea of building prison councils that were elected was a project that I worked on for 7 years. So, and they still stand to this day. So in a way, that work instigated a principle that then the prison service took on board. So there is that. It's a way of always having a mechanism for feedback. And I think that if you want to be on top of infringements to human rights in prison spaces of detention, the feedback loops, the complaint systems, they need to be really of the highest standard possible, because these are the spaces and places where vulnerability and power collide, and unconscious bias can mean that there are serious infringements of people's rights and harm, and mitigation of those harms can be changed through the implementation of representational frameworks. And I would urge you to look at that. And then the other part that I wanted to contribute was just that with the prison service in the UK, in England and Wales in particular, I've worked really hard with the senior leadership team there to create posts for people with lived experience in the policy spaces. So now there is a national lived experience lead in the prison service. There's one in the youth service, there's one in the probation service. So instigating this notion that if we are about rehabilitation, if we're actually, Jane, they're there going, everybody in prison needs to get a job, but we don't want to employ anybody ourselves.
Yeah.
Like how do you lead the way in thought leadership to say there we have actual open up. So there we have strategic leads who are building the participation frameworks, who are people with criminal records, but also that they are leading on a scheme that's called the Go Forward to Employment scheme that promises 1,000 jobs for people with criminal records within the prison service. So it's saying that if we're actually about not just punishment, about balancing the punishment with the integration piece, that we will demonstrate that it's safe and possible to do this work. And that's a massive culture shift in the UK. But I would say that these are the things that feel very promising for me in terms, and that you see the people leading the work, they're out there, they're at the meetings, they're building networks of people with lived experience within HMPPS. So that's within the administrative functions, not necessarily in the working as prison officers yet, although there is a former prisoner who I know really well, who is a senior leadership team member at a prison in the UK now. And he is leading on prisoner involvement initiatives within that. So that's his remit. But he's a senior leadership team member in a prison. So we're building this notion that justice can be shaped from the inside with partnerships with people with lived experience. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jerome, you wanted to share something?
Yes, so I wanted to share quickly some reflections of 2025 regarding the involvement of lived experience, but at an international advocacy level. So I wanted to first start the journey back in February 2025 with a Women in Corrections conference in Bangkok. And at the conference, there was a side event that had been organized and led by women with lived experience, including stories around death row as well, and the death penalty. The discussions around meaningful engagement of lived experience in prison reform at that conference gave way to discussions at the Permanent Mission of Thailand as well in Vienna, all the way up to the Crime Commission, which happens once a year in May in Vienna as well, to table as an initiative of Thailand a resolution that is being negotiated by all the member states present and adopted as well, which commemorated the UN Nelson Mandela rules and the anniversary of the Bangkok rules. Now, within this resolution, there is a paragraph that mentions meaningful involvement of lived experience in prison reform. We believe that this resolution is the first one at UN level mentioning the involvement of lived experience. So this is a huge step towards the recognition of the value, the added value of lived experience up to the international multilateral forums. So this is the first experience that we had in 2025. The second one I wanted to mention was the participation of lived experience led organizations globally through the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women, for instance, into feeding input into the report on social reintegration by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, which was published and presented at the Human Rights Council in July. So the report is available, but through and through the report, there is mentions of best practices of lived experience, organization really making a change, but also calling on the member states to include lived experience into their reform efforts. So I wanted to take this opportunity to mention these two experiences. Only this year, there is momentum, even at international level. And I think these conversations are key because they continue to feed into these processes. So I wanted to take this opportunity to share this. Thank you.
Good one. Thank you, Jerome. Any other questions?
May I? My name is Chester Lee, and I have no lived experience at all, but I'm an independent researcher doing education in prisons. And for my own research, I look at importance of offering education opportunities in Dutch and European prison and also in America. I have an American audience. I teach for an American university in Boston, and I've been here for 25 years. We have a very small campus. So I also write. So I've been just helping out with the book publishing, education in prison. But what I want to say, if I may, I have 2 questions, but I'll make it very short because I know there are other people who have got question. I'm very happy that the custodian department is here. Because as independent researchers, I bump into a lot of red tape and no from the department because they have no funding, they have no time. So I'm very happy that you actually got in it. It took me probably 10 years to get the first time to go into one prison in Barbara. And I've been lucky enough through the Department of Education's people working within the prison, being able to go to 12 or 13 Dutch prisons. I've been to most of the Scandinavian prisons, America. I just came back from St. Quentin. I've been to Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden. I'm just blushing. Just so you know, Czech Republic, Slovakia, I just came back from Romania and I'm going to Portugal next week.
It's a new John Howard.
What I'm trying to say is that I really want to say, to make sure that I've got the name right, Cammy, Sam, Paula, Twain, and Donna, remember that? I think that is, as what you said, is such a courageous thing to be speaking about the past trauma and to be involved in this. So I really commend your courage and all this really wonderful work that you want to put in. I find it difficult for my work to reach out for ex-incarcerated population. In the Netherlands, they believe in second chance. So in the really whole arena, at least I'm speaking of the Dutch landscape, for me to want to go back to find those ex-prisoners is so difficult, but they just want to get on with their life. And also not to be identified. So Kelly is right here, I'm gonna get his phone number. They just want to move on. So my question is, how do you balance all of you to say, look, I want to get their involvement because they are the ones who should be in the criminal reform because they know what's best for them. I'm an outsider, I'm nobody. I feel so small in the presence of all three of you. And so that's, how do you balance that, giving them the rights to move on without the stigma of I am a prisoner and always been a prisoner. No, you want to move on. And also getting, so that is a question for everybody. And that is so important for me to find out. If I may, how do you find these people? Because the Department of Justice is not giving me anything. I will tell you, because of privacy. Right? So I cannot find in any statistics, Kali, or anybody else, so that I can say, what happened after
You can imagine how
sorry,
I started my CBO, the foundation when I start. I work at United because there we work with volunteers and we have about 7,000 incarcerated individuals that we see, and so we get weekly requests. Can you provide us from journalists, researchers, documentary makers, writers, everyone, I get weekly requests, and that's just us. And there are a lot of organizations that all I have to say, also the prisons themselves, they get a lot of requests. So I think it's also the way that I do it, I look at the value, like how big of an impact will it have, how it would be helpful for the people that we, because you don't want to be called every time, you participate on this interview. You don't want to be asked, because every time we ask, or if I get asked, it diminishes you again, because it puts you back, you are the formerly incarcerated individual. So I think, I know I'm speaking in front of my colleague, for instance, make the same evaluation, you don't want to.
And if I could make something extracted.
It's not the job of our staff to get interviewed. So you'll have to imagine that we have over 10 research proposals per week. So, and if you do research, there will be also acknowledgements and conclusions. And you have to work with that for somehow. So for example, your research on female detention, that is for us a very important one, but also a complete research that also takes into account the multiple goals we have. It's not only about human treatment, it's also about security, it's also about reintegration. So we have conflicting goals. So, and a problem for a system like us can be that researchers tend to just pick one little piece and say, that's totally wrong what you do. And that's very complex for us to implement. So Maybe that's also an advice to, if you do a proposal somewhere, to imagine how it is for a system to work there.
I don't mean to be a criticism, to be honest. I just meant that, you know, for I have an audience American and they come from a very different world.
Yeah.
If I may.
Mhm.
So I think I see my humbling work, if I may, is that's to educate the audience. And I also took students to prisons. You know, I've been to Brabant prison with the American audience. I find it very important for them to see it themselves. And I find it very important. It's not meant to be criticism. It's just that there's a lot of and I understand the demand of custodians that they have to decide which study will bring added value for them. It is bothering them as well. I'm just ventilating.
Yeah.
And for me to say that I do my work with compassion, with respect, because this is such a sensitive work. But I think that there are rooms for people who have no lived experience that collaborate.
Yeah.
Everybody can put in their role. And for my student, I think is to know that there are different ways to treat detainees. And that for me is important.
I just wanted to add to that. I think, I think it's a good thing that that the institution provides the individual that freedom as to whether or not they want to engage in that type of research. Yes, lived experience is broad, but within that we have our own experiences, and we might want to talk about this part of our experience, but not that part for a particular reason. And giving the person the agency to decide is, in my view, the whole point of lived experience. But to add to that as well, and to what you said about the goals and priorities, I think what I always tell my counterparts that work in departments is often lived experience is only part of the end game. It's part of the solution. The department goes, these are our problems. Can you help us with our solutions? But I think that's problematic. I think lived experience needs to be engaged at the very start. We need to co-produce what the problems are in the first place and go, what are, for example, in the research domains, what are the research domains that people with experience think matter? Because if we talk about this idea of rehabilitation, and when you said that, I'm reminded of Matheson's work on prisons and trial, in particular his work on this idea of rehabilitation, to engage people with lived experience and what are the actual problems within the prison system. And now I recognize that in the context of the Netherlands, yes, your prison system is far better than many parts of the world. I completely agree, and I don't, I recognize that. But within that system, there are still problems with it. And I think lived experience isn't about co-producing solutions, but it's about co-producing what the problem actually is. And I know my colleague here, Donna, is a massive fan of a colleague of mine who works in my university, and she asked, what's the problem represented to be? But in order to get that representation, we also need to involve people with lived experience. And so maybe, and I say this all the time to my counterparts in departments, when you create your goals, when you create your objectives, when you sit down to think about your strategic plan for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, involve people with lived experience in what that strategic plan is. And then so you genuinely walk alongside them, and it doesn't become what Joe says is a tokenistic, icing on the top. And yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah, I was probably kind of like add, look, you got a different perspective as well. It's Scott. Sorry. It's fine. Yeah, I'm actually looking at it. It's not just in terms of what happens within systems. So a lot of my actual research is actually around what does belonging look like for individuals with that experience of or that lived experience of the criminal legal system. And I actually look around education, and I look at higher education. And what you basically find is that institutions or organizations outside in society don't have mechanisms to support individuals through that. So a lot of those voices get missed along the way. So for me, I'm actually looking at what does it mean to belong in higher education if you have that experience yourself, but there's nothing there. Even the language from in terms of official regulatory bodies still uses outdated language. So in a sense, it's not just what actually happens in the system. It needs to be the shift, what happens in society, what happens in organizations, what is that additional support that will actually help individuals. Because as we've kind of discussed, a lot of us come out that system damaged, but no one actually ever asks the voice of what is that damage, what support do you need, how do you actually then grow forward as well. I know it's not necessarily relevant to your question, but it's something that needs to be thought of in terms of in a wider issue. If you really want people to actually contribute and have that meaningful role in society, what do you then do in those other areas to support them? Because a lot of needs go amiss, and a lot of people will fade into it. But the fact that you mentioned that they fade is, how do they then get supported when they have this harm or this structural harm that's been caused by systems as well? So yeah, so I just wanted to kind of I always like to flick it into a different thing, because it's a wider issue than just that penal space within education, because education is seen to be one of the biggest things that can actually lead people into new ways of thinking in different forms, that has that transformative nature. But we don't actually ever think about it that way. So I think it needs to not just be at the actual that side of things, it needs to be at the wider side. But that's just me using this as a platform to say something.
Scott, thank you, but because in the Netherlands, we have a lot of restraint. I mean, in Scandinavian countries, we have an import model, meaning that education within the prison is offered by Ministry of Education. So I'm championing this country, which the governor or the director of the prison decide how much, who can go to education, and that is really a different story. And I know enough to champion, and that is what I'm against the championing. In America, NGO takes over, California takes over. 125 program within St. Quentin or San Diego prison, we just came from. They have all their abundant resources. In our country, is that down to the director? I'm not complaining, I'm sorry. Just want to share that I really completely understand where you come from, and that is really, really grateful. Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to follow up.
It's not correct what you say, because it's a right that you can have education in that prison.
I'm not gonna argue with anybody, but it's just that I'm sorry for that.
Say something, it should be correct. So it's a right to have education in Dutch prisons, and it's in the daily program.
It is, but
very
it's
much based on the rights.
But you are in a ministry position. I'm not going to argue, but I'm in the prison for 12 of them, and every time I went in to talk to the governor, it's up to the director who decide the budget, not the Ministry of Education, and that is factual.
Okay, I'm gonna stop this discussion. I have someone here who wants to ask the question.
No,
You raised your hand, or?
Well, I was just wondering, because we talked about how the system is also deeply gendered, but I think it's also important how it's deeply racial. And I was just wondering, especially also in the Netherlands, and when I heard your research topic, I was just wondering, because I didn't hear that aspect. I heard you looking into women's experience and non-binary transgender people generally, or people who don't fit into the heteronormative boxes. I was wondering if your research also touches upon deeper intersectionalities.
Yes, it does. Yeah, I have a background in gender and post-colonial studies, and I really aim to do an intersectional analysis of gender system and also people's experiences. So also in our report and in the articles that we're writing, we always focus on different aspects of identity that intersect and how it impacts people experience in and out of prison. So yeah, also in my upcoming research, we'll also go, if everything works out, we'll go to the island of Bonaire, which is part of the Dutch prison system as well, and we'll definitely focus on the aspects of culture, but also on the post-colonial part, and on. So yeah, definitely, I think it's very important. I think it's also a very under-researched part of identity in general, but definitely in prison. And yeah, it's also something that came out of our previous research. We really found that women of color, for instance, were often labeled as loud or too much or not well behaved, whereas then some white women would be seen as, civil. And so yeah, that's definitely part of our research. I think it's very important. Yeah, it's a really important point.
Could I just recommend everyone to read the research? Because it's so insightful and it's written, the whole perspective is not of the researchers and their frameworks. It's really lived experience that are centerpiece. And I think it's, for many people, maybe not for this audience, but for many people, it can serve as an eye-opener on what it means to be there. And then try and build your own, or question your own moral neutrality.
I think that's
it's really one of the best that I ever read. So,
that's fabulous. And I think I was going to just maybe ask everybody to reflect on the point that was made around the courage it takes to speak out. And I think when you said that, I was reflecting on, is lived experience and identity I think we talked about it. And the thing is, and I don't know about the context here in the Netherlands, but in the UK, we criminalise a lot of people. So the government's own statistics published this year say 12.4 million people in the UK have a criminal record. We have a population, I think, of 70, 65. This is an enormous amount of people with criminal records. And the overarching culture is that it's a stigmatizing experience. So yeah, in a way it does take courage, but it's unfortunate that it takes courage when it's actually a very broadly normalized experience of 12.4 million people with a criminal record. But we are driven, but the culture of disdain and lack of trust in the UK, you know, discriminatory attitudes to employment, discriminatory attitudes in education, you know, and also, you know, referencing your point around guilt, shame, and justified nervousness. There is, let's not sugarcoat it. There are justifiable reasons why we would feel nervous to have some people and their offences. You know, we are, you know, apprehensive, and that's justifiable too. I think my point is then, like, why do people with lived experience come out and say something? I think there's a difference between lived experience leadership, the leaders with lived experience who want to try to reflect on their individual journeys, reflect more broadly about context, and try to participate. I think that's a different cohort of people from generally people with lived experience. And I think there's a real risk of exploiting people with lived experience because they're the shorthand entertainment at conferences. They're the shorthand, you know, like instead of using Google and reading the research, let's just go and ask a person. Like that makes me really nervous. But I think that the history of change is that it comes across with sharing ideas, collaborating, moving forward, challenging discourse, influencing people by good quality research, you know, that. So I think the point is the identity issue is really complicated because, yeah, I've told you I've been to prison, but I'm also a mom. I could have told you about being a mom. I could have told you about being a grandma with 8 children. I could have told you about being a CEO at Unlock. Do you know what I mean? There's so much, the duality, the multi-dimensional aspects of people with lived experience. So just in this context, I'm talking about that. But and I've done a lot of therapeutic work on myself, so I feel confident and safe to do that. Not everybody has had the benefit of that, so it can be a very unsafe identity for people too. So we need to also consider how we build up people's strengths, capacity. You know what you're saying, Camille. You know the. And some people do want to go on and disappear, and that's fine too. You know, that's fine too. Like you said, go on and do your life. My experience in the UK is it's not that easy to hide from your criminal records. You know, because when you go for a job, when you try to come, go to the US, I got refused going to the US. I've been out of prison 17 years. You know, next year we have the ETA coming in to come to Europe. It will ask people to declare if they've had a criminal record, and they won't get the automatic visa from the UK to come to Europe. You know, there are so many different ways that follows you and the psychological impact. So I think it's, I don't know, maybe open up the floor. I think it's a really complicated topic.
I would just like to touch on, and this is in the UK, my experience, everyone has a different experience. I think the prison is the punishment, and I think when we're looking at human rights and conditions, that is so important. But usually when you go to prison, that is the crime, like I was even guilty. I think regarding education, it persuaded me it was a positive in prison, to be truthful. The issue I had is the aftermath. That's why I focus on the aftermath. Now at the moment too, I'm ready to do a coaching course to become a professional coach, because going forward, what I want to do, it's going to tie in. I got through one of the strongest application forms, got the notification, but then I had a call this week about my criminal record, even though it's spent. I have to sit a panel But in the process of it, as Paula said, like Paula, I've done a lot of healing. So I've dealt with myself, you know, you have to. That's why my organisation deals therapeutic, because the journey of rejection needs the mindset to be broadened, it needs to be strong, and it needs to have a attitude of being immune to rejection. But remembering that, as I said, when people commit a crime, that's the punishment. And unfortunately, I'm not saying, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm too much. If you've got a record, just get on with your life. But what I'm trying to explain is that the record comes because of a breaking of a law. And unfortunately, the system in the UK, I believe, isn't fit for purpose. And that's just my belief in the movement of excelling yourself. And the issue I have is actually wasn't the prison. The prison actually did me good, but everyone has different opinions and different experiences, because I spoke about the round circle of the cocktail, and we have different characters in it. Regarding me within the cocktail, prison did me good, if that makes sense. The issue I had was the release. Anything that you're trying to challenge, it becomes a challenge. And then I'm dealing with being female and a black woman with a criminal record. And that's why I said we have to look on individuals completely different, especially when we're dealing with framework. Because when we talk about the lived experience, to me, it's a cocktail again. I haven't really got a representation. I represent myself. And the reason I do that is because this cocktail is so unique. See, the way I've just spoke about, I can speak to many people with lived experiences, but the only thing we actually have in common is that we may be female and have been to prison, and that's it. But if you don't understand it, you will assume we have a lot of things in common, and that's why I'm very unique about the conversation on it, and trying to get the message that we need to deal with this cocktail individual. We need to pull out the cherries, we need to pull out the kiwi, and we need to recognise that even though they are bound together, and it says convictions, it's actually so unique and so different that if you don't understand it, say for instance, I'll just give a quick scenario. Me and Paula have both been incarcerated. We're both women. Paula's a white lady, I'm a black lady, of course. The only thing really me and Paula have in common, even though we show other things personal, is the fact that we're female and we've been to prison. Now, if Paula's scenario was to sit with someone that is going to design a piece of framework for females within community, which is brilliant, that framework mightn't fit me. And this is what we have to remember. And that's not to say Paula's contribution is any less, because it is. But what I'm saying is it has to be diverse, and we have to recognise this cocktail. The strawberry does not fulfil everything. There is kiwi, there is banana, there is ranges of tropical fruits, not being funny, apart from the plain apples and oranges. And it's important to investigate it, because my issue was, like I said in the beginning, my organisation was created as a safety. It was created because of the lack of opportunities and disadvantage, because I didn't want to become a statistic. I was a young offender and I was a young lady that got released, and I weren't giving up on my one life, unfortunately, but fortunately. And the issue I've always had, like I've just said, the framework is not fitting individuals, it's making it, it's a depressant. That's why I deal with therapeutic, because the framework has never, it doesn't fit me. I've been on this journey nearly 20 years, and it doesn't fit me, and that's why I created my own organisation, and that's why I also, my movement's a little bit slower, and people always say to me, you've been going a long time, like, shouldn't you be there and there? What people don't understand is I've done my own rehabilitation and I'm dealing with my own mental health. So you have to be careful with your movements, because if you get too banned in with opportunities and doing this, you may fail mentally. So it's my responsibility as someone with a record, which was my own fault. You know, I was guilty. I might have been naive, but I was guilty, and I broke the rule, and that is the consequences of it. I went to prison, and as I said, you know, I've seen many things that weren't right in justice movements, and you know, but I also seen many things that were right. I had a wonderful personal officer, not to go on about it, and I was encouraged to do education. I didn't want to do it, but I had the education coming every day to sit down with me and try and build relationships to get me into that room, and it was in the end successful. But what I'm trying to say, like I said in the beginning when we all went round, it's also about the individual, because I also believe in the movements of lived experience. It is important to have researchers and people, even though they don't have an experience, because I'll tell you why. It's important for people that don't have the experience to have the experience of knowledge through the lenses of someone within their career, number one. And second of all, to lessen harm when they are interviewing people. And number three, another thing, researchers are very important, and so is the attitude. Because I'm not going to go on about Jill again, because she doesn't like me going on about it.
She don't like
No, she doesn't like it, but I'll make it clear we're sort of a black lady and here being a white lady as a professional too. And I don't like to bring colour into it, but it is important too, because society, we hide away from it. And by hiding away and not conversating, it spoils framework, and people like me can't live in it. It's important for researchers in this arena lived experience, not only for the fact of the contribution they're going to bring to change and better change and policies, but it's important for researchers to be able to build relationships. I've been in a relationship, not like sexual. I think we went there, it's only like together in a room, there's nothing wrong. Yeah, it makes sense. So, we've been in a professional friend relationship since 2012. She's been getting to know me and I've been getting to know her, and she's been getting to know the organisation. What I've always learned in my journey is that people come and go. They never sustain realness, and the lived experience is about realness. To me, lived experience is about, and this is where it complements in the lived experience, but it also complements the researcher, and this is what defines to me. Lived experience to me is the lived experience person being able to see key issues that someone that would have been in, but they complement each other. If that makes sense, meaning it's important for the researcher, even though they haven't walked it as the experience, but it's important for them to have that knowledge. They can only have that knowledge and understand it and walk it by having a character of being able to listen, being able to make changes themselves. Because if you haven't been through things, there's nothing wrong with that. That's why I said, what I just hope the lived experience movement doesn't become toxic in a way of a competition, even though life is a competition, not being funny, but in a healthy way. And I hope it really doesn't, and I hope it doesn't throw people off that, oh, we feel like we're being pushed out, because you know, if it does, it will really sadden me, because they both complement each other. And I think that movement can't go. So I think, you know, to look at it in a way of, oh, we may be pushed out, or what's going on. I don't see that in my mind. I see the compliments of it. I see the beauty of it, and then I see the way that can bring a better change, and the likes of me and other people in society are allowed to live their lives, because we have policies that says about, you know, lessening the people equality's life is actually a law, is breaking the law if you were in the hospital, and, you know, or if you were in a department. But why shouldn't that be the same for people that have paid the price, if that makes sense? Because that's all that's happening. Society is lessening the quality of people like me. And then if I begin to have children, their lives become lessened, and because of my crime, not because of their crime. So I just thought I'd touch on that.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's time, and we're in the Netherlands, and we're very strict with time. So we're gonna end this. Session. I want to. Yeah, there is a possibility. But I just wanted to thank you all very much for the courage that has been recognized already a few times. Thank you so much. And for the wonderful contribution. I think it's been a really rich conversation that started spontaneously, and we wanted it informal. Also, I think because it does justice to the setting and the topic. So thank you so much. I hope you can bring back the knowledge to wherever you go, and we hope to stay in contact. Thank you so much. There are some drinks there.
Yes.